One of Australia's biggest oil and gas companies has signalled a war with the government over the carbon tax, and it has a familiar battle cry. Echoing the successful scare campaign against the mining tax, Woodside Petroleum says if liquid natural gas exports are subjected to the carbon tax, it will drive away investment and retard a growing industry. But others are questioning the energy giant's claims, as political correspondent Tom Eagleton reports from Canberra.
On the face of it, it's a win-win. Australia's massive gas reserves have the potential to make it the Saudi Arabia of the South Pacific. And since it's cleaner burning than coal, the LNG industry says it's a perfect replacement energy source for coal-fired power stations, lowering global emissions.
Gas is viewed by everybody else in the world as a solution, a good thing. Whereas it seems like the Australian government, the last couple of governments, have seemed to think that it's just another thing to put a penalty against.
The LNG industry is arguing it shouldn't pay the carbon tax because it's helping to contribute to lowering greenhouse emissions. But others are sceptical.
That position that's been put forward by the LNG industry that they're a clean energy source really does need to be challenged. In Western Australia, certainly, we have a situation where the LNG industry have overtaken coal as the state's biggest pollution source, and we're likely to see a doubling in West Australia's emissions, principally due to increases in the LNG industry in this state.
The federal government's figures bear that out. The Climate Change Department conservatively estimates the LNG processing industry will add 11% to Australia's existing carbon emissions by 2020 as exports to India and China surge. The projected growth of Australian carbon emissions closely follows the same growth curve as exports of LNG. Government figures suggest LNG is the biggest single source of new emissions over the next decade. That's because of the massive amount of energy it takes to liquefy natural gas to create LNG for export.
When you look across the whole life cycle at LNG projects and the massive amount of carbon pollution that is released by these projects during the processing of the LNG, when it's taken out of the ground and processed, what you find is that LNG is not much cleaner than coal.
The government's committed to cutting carbon emissions by 5% by 2020, putting it on a collision course with a powerful new carbon-intensive industry. Woodside's American CEO Don Volte is leading the charge.
I mean, the stoush has just begun.
The government's carbon tax threatens to undermine profits from Woodside's soon-to-be-realised $25 billion-plus export bonanza selling LNG to China. With rising labour costs and a strong Australian dollar, Volte warns the tax could cast a shadow on the promise of Australia's domination of the global gas market.
You add a little bit more, add a little bit more, add a little bit more, there's not a lot left. And board of directors start scratching their head, why the hell are we making these investments?
But independent economists find that hard to believe, given the almost insatiable demand for LNG from China and India, willing to pay almost any price.
These companies are all benefiting from that increased demand for gas, and therefore it seems to me that if they're taking one side of the coin in terms of increased demand, they should be probably taking the other side of the coin as well in terms of having to pay a carbon price.
The government too is promising it will make the LNG industry accountable for its arguments for protection from the carbon tax.
They are the issues that we will be considering, and the companies have been asked to supply my department, association with the Department of Climate Change, appropriate material, going to them proving their case.
The Minister may also have to take into account other objections to the way Western Australia's gas reserves are being used. Local energy users are angry about limited access they have to the reserves. The government recently commissioned 3 new coal-fired power stations.
It's a perverse outcome where we do have the world's the largest gas resources in Australia, and yet prices here have gone through the roof, and we can't find contracts to underpin long-term industry or gas-fired power stations. We have a natural competitive advantage in energy. It's vital that we use these resources to supply industry and to supply jobs and exports.
Kevin Rudd won lukewarm support from the LNG industry for his emissions trading scheme proposal when he offered the industry compensation. But now the industry says that was before the collapse of the Copenhagen summit and with it a global ETS system, and now all bets are off. Tom Eagleton, Lateline.